All right, everyone. Well, we'll call it to order here. So it's about 5 after 6, just about. My name's Andy Spurka. I'm with the Ventura County Resource Conservation District. I'm the Resource Conservation Specialist here. I'm hosting this meeting in partnership with a colleague of mine, Elaine Himmelfarb, who's the Executive Director of Ventura Regional Fire Safe Council. So we just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone for taking the time tonight to come in and listen about this series. This speaker series will span across the next 2 years. It's going to occur bi-monthly. This is the first of the series, and it's going to be focused on everything wildfire prevention, recovery, and education. Of course, some of you may have heard, we will be recording this speaker series, so please note it's going to be posted online. I had a lot of inquiries, so whatever you choose to say, it will go out to the internet at some point, just so you're all aware. But yeah, so we hope this can be an opportunity for community members to engage with wildfire experts and personnel, land managers, everyone in your region. That's the idea here. So how these are going to be structured is that the first about 30 or 45 minutes are going to be a presentation by the guest speakers. And as you guys saw, there's a whole lineup. It's going to be every other month. And at the end of the guest speakers, we're going to do a short Q&A after, about 10-15 minutes of Q&A with the presenters. So please hold your questions off till the end. Feel free to type them into the chat box just so they're saved there. I'll check that. But without further ado, I will introduce the speakers moving forward here. So our first speaker is Matthew Shapero. He's a livestock and range advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. We also have Kenneth Van Wig here with the Ventura County Fire Department. He's a fire captain. He's one of the many fire professionals. And then we have Shane Deweys. I'm sorry, Shane, if I butchered that. He is a PhD candidate with UC Santa Barbara. He's going to be the ecologist on the call here. So with that being said, Matthew, I think you're the first one who will be sharing the screen.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, let me just get that lined up. Can everyone see that?
Oh, I think I need to stop sharing mine. Sorry about that. Try again. There we go, Matthew.
Is that working?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Andy. And it's exciting to be here. Andy, when you reached out a couple of months ago and extended the invitation, your charge was fairly broad, right? And this is the first talk in a 2-year series. And so we sort of worked through this notion of presenting, sort of a basic primer on both understanding wildfire behavior, patterns in the county, ecology, and impacts to various industries. And as Andy mentioned, I work with UC Cooperative Extension. More specifically, I'm the livestock and range advisor. So I think about wildfire in the context of rangelands and wildlands, and then also how it impacts livestock, agriculture, and ranching in particular here in Ventura County. I did go a little bit rogue because the initial invitation was just to me. But as I got thinking about how I wanted to present the material, I realized that rather than having me sort of go on for 30, 45, 60 minutes myself to try to sort of summarize this, pretty big topic, that it would be, I thought, effective to introduce or to include a few others. And so I invited Ken and Shane to participate. And so you'll see as we go forward here, I'll sort of weave them into the presentation in slightly different ways. I like starting here on this slide. This is an image of I'm standing on a ranch on some private land above the Santa Clara River Valley, sort of sandwiched between Ventura and cities of Ventura and Santa Paula. I like starting here just because I think, especially for folks who are, a broad audience, sort of general public, a lot of people don't get a chance to get out into portions of Ventura County like this. A lot of our county is pretty inaccessible Forest Service. Other parts of it are private lands that are unavailable to the general public. And I think spinning the typical view of Ventura County in this way, I think, I'm encouraging you to sort of think a little bit more broadly than maybe you normally do about how Ventura County works, the lands and the vegetation types. So from here, I will, next slide. So this is kind of what I was thinking for the talk over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm gonna offer a few slides just sort of setting the stage. And then as I mentioned, I'm gonna include Ken and Shane into the presentation. And really what I was wanting to do as I thought about how to sort of introduce the idea of wildfire in Ventura County was really recognizing that, at least for me, the way that I think about wildfires through a couple of different lenses. Some of them, in my mind, that are at points in tension with one another. So the lenses that I'm offering to think about wildfire this evening is through sort of the fire professional lens, the ecologist's lens, and then maybe the agricultural lens. And so I'll conclude by sort of talking and thinking through how wildfire impacts agriculture, ranching in particular, but I'm going to lean on Ken and Shane to offer their perspectives from the fire professional and ecologist lens. And then we'll finish up hopefully with plenty of time for questions. So maybe many of you have seen maps like this. CAL FIRE has this kind of incredible database that dates back to the late 19th century that attempts to catalog and document all the wildfires that have transpired across the state. And admittedly, I'm sure the records get sort of less accurate and less precise the further back you go, but nevertheless, it gives, I think, a good general sense of fire, number of fires, fire perimeters, and the timing of those fires. And so for these next few slides, I'm going to go through our history, our Ventura County history, in chunks of 2 decades. And so this is the first chunk. The record starts in 1898 and through 1919, and you can get a sense of where fires occurred during those decades. And hopefully you guys can see my cursor. What I want to emphasize here, just that you know, City of Ventura is help orient you on the map. So City of Ventura is roughly here, the Oxnard Plain here, Santa Clara River Valley here, Santa Monica Mountains down here. So first couple decades of the record, 1920 to 1939, we see more fires just as a number. They also were much larger, and in fact, the Matilaha fire that started on U.S. Forest Service ground in 1932 remains to this day one of at least the top 10 largest fires in Ventura County, and that's this fire here, this footprint that's above the city of Ventura and Santa Paula. 1940 to 1959, a quieter set of decades. The largest fire was down here in the Santa Monica Mountains, the Sherwood Zuma fire. Much less activity up in these lands up here above Santa Clara River Valley. 1960 to 1979. You'll see for almost all of these bins of decades, we vary around 70 to 90 fires per bin, which is interesting to me that there's a relative consistency there. The mean acreage does appear to be increasing across time, and you'll see when we get to the last slide. And here, this Clampett fire here in 1970 actually started in Los Angeles County and creeped into Ventura County, but is again a fairly large fire, still ranks in the top 10 for Ventura County. 1980 to 1999, again, an increase in the average number of acres on the high end for the number of burns. And then the sort of infamous, I think many alive still remember the Wheeler fire in 1985, which started in the Wheeler Gorge above Ojai. And this is, for me, really the shocking slide. This is the last 20 years. The number of fires increases, the mean doubles, nearly doubles. There's a little bit of a reporting error in the CAL FIRE data. It appears that they changed the way that they cataloged fires, so the median is a little bit misleading. But as so many of us obviously still remember the Thomas Fire outlined by my cursor here, at the time the largest fire in state history. So this image is all decades of fire superimposed onto one another. And I think for me, the sort of striking takeaway of this image is that, you know, this county has burned many times over in all the same places. And you can see that even in just the last 20 years, essentially, we've burned almost all acreage that have burned in the preceding 120 years. Only just to say that wildfire is a deep and recurring part of our history in Ventura County, and that especially in the last 20 years, we've had an amazingly active wildfire history. Here you can see the top 10 fires as measured by acreage, and 7 of the 10 largest fires all time have occurred in the last 20 years. So the question then becomes, what, based on history and our current scenario, how can we think about wildfires of the future? And I mentioned, as people were getting on the call last week, we hosted a climate change series, the University of California did in Ventura County. And we talked a little bit about, we had presentations from climatologists and then also wildfire specialists, and talked a little bit about, how we might think about fire moving into the future. This graph is a little bit busy. Basically, it summarizes fires from the last 20 years or so. The depth of the color red is the duration of the fire. The height of the spike is the number of acres. But what I want to draw out of this, and it isn't necessarily represented by this graph in particular, but some takeaways that I took away from the presentation last week, in particular, Daniel Swain, the climatologist who spoke on sort of climatological and meteorological trends into the the next couple decades. Thinking specifically about wildfire, there's good evidence to suggest that we're going to be having more of them. They'll be more frequent. And that's in part a function of an increase in human ignitions or human-related ignitions. But it's also a function of the second bullet point, which is we're going to have more severe wildfire conditions, right? So the dry season is going to be longer. We're going to have drier fuels. We're going to have sometimes less precipitation, but precipitation condensed into a shorter wet period. And although there's still research that needs to happen around the winds, I understood from Daniel that the Santa Ana or the Diablo winds up in Northern California are going to become more regular and more severe. And I mentioned sort of the longer fire season. And then an interesting piece here too is just that fires generally are going to take longer to suppress. I think both given their scale and size, but then also the way that resources are strained across the state during wildfire season. So with that framing, I wanted to turn to Ken, if you don't mind unmuting Ken, and Andy, if you can figure out how to pin video. But if I exit can you see my full screen?
Yeah, we're showing your full screen. So who was going to play the video? Was it you or Ken?
No video. I just have Ken doesn't have a presentation per se. Instead, it's going to be a little bit of a Q&A, and I have some prompts for Ken. I do have some slides that I think will be pertinent for some of the things that we'll discuss, but just to kind of get into it, I was hoping, Ken, if you could describe for us, who you are, your current role with Ventura County Fire, and maybe pertinently, what your history is with wildland fire within the department and within Ventura County.
Yeah, certainly. So Ken Van Wig, I'm a fire captain in the Wildland and Aviation Division, and in the unit we manage all the hand crews, the helicopters, and the dozers. One of my specific jobs is Vegetation Management Program Manager. So my job is either fuels treatments, prescribed burning, fire road, and fuel break maintenance, that kind of stuff. I've been in the fire service for about 33 years. I've been in this unit in the Wildland Division for just 7 years now, and been in wildland fire for my whole career, responding and suppressing wildfires. But it's always been a passion of mine, and it's something that I've always enjoyed. It's the strategic, tactical fight of a fire is something I enjoy very much, and it's something I've done for quite a while.
And can you talk a little bit about what fighting wildland fire in Ventura County looks like, and maybe in the course of your career? I mean, it sounds like you've been on a number of the fires that I've kind of described over the last couple of minutes.
Starting in the late 80s, looking at those fires, I've been on pretty much all the ones you mentioned and showed on those slides. But over the years, it seems like, the first captains that I worked for told me that every fire is going to repeat itself. So we fight the fire the way we did the last time, or the way it worked last time, you know? So, and that has been true. I've seen the same fires burn in the same areas over and over again. And we use the same suppression tactics most of the time, that where it worked last time, it's going to work again, that kind of stuff. Fires have gotten worse. It seems that the climate has changed enough that we have, you know, the stronger winds that last longer. Look, the Thomas fire, we had sustained winds, you know, northeast winds that are our Santa Ana winds that lasted for almost 2 weeks, that pushed that fire. So typically we don't have those. We'll have them for a day, 2, maybe 3 or 4 days, but for 2 weeks it was pretty substantial.
Ken, do you feel like it's accurate to say that you're engaged in fire suppression, or is it really sort of like fire management, in the sense that you're sort of like pushing fires away from critical resources?
It really depends on the weather. If we get an ignition on a typical day with our typical diurnal winds, we focus on suppression. Of course, there's always that need for structure and infrastructure protection, but we have the ability to focus on suppression efforts. When we have those wind-driven fires, we can't get out in front of it to stop it. We do as best as we can with our structure protection, and we try to corral the fire or direct it into, you know, somewhere where it's heading that's not going to be impacting the infrastructure. But we can't always do that. We do the best we can. A lot of times we'll use burning to keep it from getting into certain areas, you know, that kind of stuff. But for the most part,
one of the things that
typical day, we really work hard on suppressing fires. It's those wind-driven fires that we just can't get in front of.
One of the things that is striking to me as I was putting the historical slides together is, you know, obviously fires, not always, but largely were smaller, you know, 50 years ago, say. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why that was, if it's sort of a historical legacy of the fuels and the vegetation, different sort of wind events, different firefighting tactics. I presume that firefighting suppression tactics today are more sophisticated than they were 50 years ago. Do you have any thoughts on that front?
I guess the only thing I could think of is maybe back in the day, the grazing practices throughout the county might have been greater. Prescribed fire might have been easier to obtain. It's a struggle for us environmentally to do prescribed fire nowadays, but it could be the climate. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that the county way back in history used to be grazed pretty heavily, sheep, goats, cattle. With all the infrastructure coming in, all the communities, those areas have been kind of secluded, and now that vegetation's grown, had a chance to grow, and it's larger. It's getting out of hand, really, if you think about it.
So we've spoken before about how fuel loading or vegetation sort of kind and structure affects fire behavior and fire path, but then also you've talked already just tonight about the overriding effects of wind. I'm wondering if there's any more to say about how you see vegetation and fuel loading affecting fire intensity and direction versus wind. Is one kind of fire easier to fight than another?
Oh, absolutely. When there's no wind on the fire is going to run with topography. It runs uphill, upslope, up drainage, backs downhill slowly against the natural terrain. When there's wind involved, it's going to run with the wind, and the terrain really doesn't matter. So when we have a fire that's burning up to a ridge line, if there's no wind pushing it, when it gets to that ridge line, it's going to hamper the speed of the fire, the intensity, and we can hopefully manage that fire when it gets to the ridge line. That's why we'll use air tankers to put retardant on ridge lines. We'll put dozer lines on ridge lines. We'll put hand crews working ridge lines to remove that fuel. So when it gets there, we can hopefully suppress that fire. When it's wind driven, it's blowing embers across the ridge to the other side and starting on the next slope, you know? So The heavier the fuel, the more intense, the hotter the fire, the more BTU it's putting off. It's harder to maintain. We have a hauling chart. We can determine by fire intensity and flame length if we can manage the fire with ground troops, firefighters on the ground, or if we need to use mechanized equipment or aircraft, or if we just can't manage it because it's so big. And we can typically fight a fire by hand tools and hose lines when the fire flame lengths are 4 or 5 feet. Gets any more than that, and we just can't get to it. With the heavier vegetation, a little grass fire is usually 2 to 4 foot flame lengths. We can handle that. When you start getting into chaparrals, new growth, anything that hasn't burned in the last 15 years or has burned within the last 15 to 20 years, we call that new growth vegetation. There's a lot less dead and down understory, so it doesn't burn as readily. The fuel moistures have to be a lot lower for that to carry fire. When it starts getting over 15 to 20 years old, you'll start seeing that dead understory. The tops of the plants or the chaparrals green and nice looking, but that understory just builds up all this dead and down over years of decay, really, and growth just dying off. And now we have that heavy fuel loading. And when we have that, that's when we need the mechanized equipment. We need aircraft to help support us. We have to find positions where the fuel changes enough that we can suppress the fire.
That's kind of a perfect segue, Ken, into this slide that I put together based on some of our conversation, but I'm wondering if, in a minute or two, you can sort of talk us through what you're seeing here in terms of talking about new growth and old growth chaparral.
Certainly. So if you look at the Thomas Fire of 2017, and if you look at where we were able to corral that fire and extinguish it, it burned into the Piru fire scar, it burned into the Day fire scar, it burned into the Zaka fire scar, and because of the newer growth vegetation, it hampered the fire behavior enough that we were able to suppress that fire and manage it.
So go ahead.
If you look farther to the west into Santa Barbara, the fire ran into the T fire and the Jesucita fire scar, and that's where we were able to contain the fire there.
So one of the sort of big picture questions I have for you, Ken, is, what in your mind, given, looking at these wildfire history slides, given your experience as a wildland firefighter, and in your current role as the VMP coordinator in Ventura County, in your mind, what does a sort of responsible fuels or vegetation management program look like in the county, and at what scale, and maybe where? I do just want to let you know, I have those slides that refer to Barlow Canyon, if that's a helpful prompt, but also maybe just talking more generally about where and how vegetation management might happen in the county in your mind.
Well, I guess it would benefit us if we could do a lot of fuel treatments around the communities to lessen the likelihood of a more devastating fire. We just don't have the resources, the time, the ability to do that. When we do prescribed fire, we've had great success in limiting fire behavior as it approaches communities. We do some grazing projects with goats to limit some fuels around some communities, and we'd love to build on that. And we're working on opportunities to do that, working with landowners and land management agencies, trying to coordinate that.
Great. I might, for the sake of time, go ahead and pivot to Shane. If we have time and want to return to some of this, I mean, it's a really profound example of looking at Barlow Canyon and the prescribed fire work you did pre-Thomas Fire and the way that it didn't burn. So maybe we can return to that if folks are interested. But I do want to pivot to Shane and give Shane you an opportunity to share your screen. I guess maybe I'll stop. One of the points of tension that I'm interested in, and maybe even teasing up this evening is, you know, when you think about wildfire in the sort of fire professional context, I mean, some of the concepts are conflict some with, you know, responsible ecological management of some of these, you know, native shrubland communities, the native habitat. And so, and yet, you know, we sort of need to manage for both. And so I suppose we need to find compromise somewhere, but I hope it's interesting to sort of both be able to draw out Ken's perspective and then also hear from Shane here. So hopefully folks are able to see his screen.
We are. So Shane, you have the presenter screen being displayed right now. I'm not sure if you want to switch.
Great. Yep. Did that switch it?
Let's see. It looks like, nope. Yes.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me here, Matthew, and giving me the opportunity to share my viewpoint on wildfire. And so I got my start in ecology as a restoration ecologist, and over the last 2 or 3 years have been diving deeper and deeper into fire ecology. And I think that on the face value, like Matthew just teased, there might be some tension points between how I view fire and how for fire professionals like Ken view fire. But I think that when we get deeper, there's a lot of nuance where we can really build on each other and create ecological approaches that also help protect communities and make firefighting easier. And so for me as a plant ecologist, I really view fire as a disturbance event, but not necessarily with the negative connotation that humans view fire as a disturbance event that comes through and destroys urban areas. But I view it as a disturbance event that has led to plants to evolve adaptations to handle fire. And so fire in vegetation communities isn't always a negative disturbance. In fact, I'm sure many of you have heard the term fire adapted species. And so many plants have adapted different evolutionary traits to survive or regenerate post-fire. And fire can actually be a very necessary disturbance in ecosystems to maintain healthy communities and consistent fire regimes. And so in thinking of fire as a disturbance, there's really 3 main scales that I view fire. And so at the smallest scale, over the span of seconds to minutes and centimeters to meters, we can think of the active flame front. And so this is just a fire flame, whether it be within a wildfire or, for example, your campfire, what's actively burning. And in terms of plant ecology, how that's actively affecting an individual or even just a section of an individual. And then scaling up a little larger, we can think over the span of hours to days and meters to kilometers. And this is going to be the whole wildfire. And so this covering a larger spatial and temporal scan can have areas of different behavior. You can have areas within your wildfire perimeter that burn hotter and some areas that burn less intense. Like Ken said, topography and weather can be huge contributors along with fuel. And so this can really shape how wildfire affects a plant community as a whole. And then at the largest scale, over years to decades to even centuries, and extremely vast spatial scales of hundreds of thousands of kilometers, there's the fire regime. And so this is really going to be the what's the normal intensity for a fire to burn through? Is it going to be a surface fire or a crown fire? What's the seasonality of the fire? And how common do fires occur over decades to centuries? Do they occur every couple of years, or do they really only occur every 20 plus years? And so, as I mentioned, plants have been able to adapt to fire regimes and become very resilient and resistant to very specific fire regimes. And so the term fire adapted or fire resistant plants might not be totally accurate because plants are adapted to very specific fire regimes. And so you can imagine how a plant that's adapted to frequent low intensity surface fires might be very negatively affected by a high intensity crown fire. And so plants don't have a one size fit all approach to all fires, but have adapted over centuries and millennia to very specific fire regimes to handle those fire regimes very well. And there's two main adaptations that plants have evolved. There's seeding and resprouting. And so seeding can take a few different forms. We can think of things like pine cones, where you have your seeds enclosed in this almost armor-like structure of the pine cone that is tightly closed and protects the seed from heat and from water infiltrating in and stimulating germination. And those pine cones don't open up until they have a heat cue, and then kind of like popping popcorn, during a fire, post-fire, they'll pop open and disperse their seeds. And those seeds then can be imbibed by water and germinate. And this allows trees to germinate in light gaps that a fire might have opened up in what's otherwise a pretty closed and shaded canopy. And an alternative seeding approach is to create seeds that themselves have extremely fire resistant and hard seed coats, like we see here on the right, where these seeds actually have a seed coat that can withstand extremely high temperature fires and actually require high temperature fires to scarify and crack that seed coat and allow water to penetrate and induce germination. And so these are two examples of how plants have evolved seeding strategies to where the mature individual might die during a fire, but they're able to regenerate and regenerate in the landscape post-fire. Whereas the other main adaptation that plants have evolved is resprouting. And this is where the individual itself will survive a fire and then put out new growth. And so this occurs over a spectrum from auxiliary resprouters, where really only the leaves can die and then new leaves can be grown, to the strongest type of resprouting, basal resprouters, where the whole above ground section of the plant can actually be destroyed, and underground sections of the plant will survive and send out new shoots. And this spectrum of resprouting has been shown to correspond to disturbance severity, with those weakest auxiliary resprouters really being most frequent under extremely mild severity disturbances, and those strongest basal resprouters being most common under extremely severe disturbances. And so we can imagine our disturbance event is fire, where these auxiliary resprouters are really going to be best adapted to very low intensity surface fires, and basal resprouters are going to be most adapted to high intensity crown fires. And so kind of taking all of this sprint through vegetation ecology in terms of fire, we can apply that to Ventura County, where one of the predominant native vegetation types in Ventura is chaparral, the native shrublands. And so these communities are hardwood evergreen shrubs with an extremely high biodiversity, and they form these dense closed canopies like we see here. And they're adapted to the Mediterranean climate of Ventura, of hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. And so the natural fire regime in these communities are high intensity crown fires that come through and burn all of these shrubs. And generally that fire seasonality is going to be during that hot, dry summer, where some of this fuel can dry out and have lower live fuel moisture and become more ignitable. But during the mild, wet winters, these shrubs will generally have higher live fuel moistures and be less ignitable. And so historically, the fire seasonality in these regimes was really restricted to summer times. And the common ignition sources were lightning strikes. And then they had average return intervals of 20 to 100 plus years. And so fire, while extreme in these environments, was quite rare. And a post-chaparral fire landscape might look like something like this, where the landscape becomes quite barren. All the vegetation has been burned and scorched, and all that's left is exposed soil and these shrub skeletons. However, as we just talked about, chaparral vegetation has adapted regeneration methods to reestablish in these burned landscapes. And the two main ways are through producing these fire-resistant seeds that can survive the fire in the soil and then be stimulated to germinate and grow post-fire to reach maturity and replenish the seed bank. Or there are obligate resprouters, which will have this skeleton that has resprouts coming out from below ground. And so below ground structure will survive the fire. And then there's facultative resprouters. And so these are things like chamise, a plant that is quite common throughout Ventura County, And this both resprouts and creates fire-resistant seeds. And while this is the historic fire response and how vegetation has been adapted to respond to fire in chaparral, as Matthew showed, as fire becomes more common and human ignitions leading to more fires in these vegetation types, there can become gaps in the canopy that allow for non-native annual grasses to invade. And these non-native annual grasses will senesce and die every summer and act as really flashy fuels that can become easily ignitable and be a source of frequent ignition in these shrubbier landscapes. And so how this might occur is you can imagine a mature chaparral canopy with an established seed bank, and a fire will come through and burn the shrubs and stimulate the seed bank and allow for germination and regeneration. And then once those shrubs reach maturity in 10 to 15 years, they'll start reproducing seeds and replenishing the soil seed bank. However, if during regeneration, another fire burns through before there's been a chance for those seeders to reach maturity and replenish the seed bank, then there's no seed source available to regenerate those species. And that can lead to gaps in the canopy that these non-native grasses can then invade in. And these non-native grasses, as I said, are extremely flammable and flashy fuels in the summer months, and can allow for more and more frequent fires, which then create larger and larger gaps in the canopy and create this grass fire cycle that eventually leads up to conversion from woody vegetation to grassland savanna. And so that's kind of how, as a plant ecologist, I view wildfire historically occurring in Ventura County to how it's now more commonly occurring more frequently due to larger human ignitions and the invasion and presence of this flashier annual fuel. And so as a researcher, going back to those three kind of spatial and temporal ways that I view fire, there's kind of three main questions that I research and think about fire. The first, and what I'll briefly focus on here, is how fire regimes shape vegetation communities. And the other two, which I won't really have time to really go into today, are how fire affects individual plants, and then how fire behavior might vary over the landscape. And so briefly, just looking at research I've done to look at how fire regimes have shaped vegetation communities. To answer this, I've used an approach that's common where you use multiple years of satellite imagery to classify vegetation fluxes throughout time and then analyze potential drivers of those fluxes. And so work I've done in Ventura County in the 2003 Piru fire scar, which I believe is ranked as the 7th largest fire on that slide that Matthew showed earlier in California. We have found evidence for type conversion. And so with this, we have vegetation classified as either chaparral, grass, which is largely non-native invasive grass, sage scrub, which is smaller statured subshrubs, and then trees. So this would largely be oak savannas or full oaklands. And the red bars show the dominance of plots in 1930, and the blue bars show the dominance of plots in 2009. And we can see that in 1930, there's relatively low prevalence of grass-dominated plots and high prevalence of chaparral-dominated plots. However, by 2009, there's a pretty large decrease in both chaparral and sage-dominated plots, with the vast majority of plots being now dominated by grass. And even more so, diving deeper into, again, the red coloring here being 1930 and the blue being 2009, and looking at plots that remained dominated by chaparral in both time points, we can see that there's a reduction in chaparral cover in these plots. So not only is chaparral converting, but areas that are still dominated by chaparral are becoming less dominated by chaparral, with that cover largely being replaced by non-native grasses. And we see a similar and actual larger trend in sage scrub. And so we can see that not only is type conversion occurring, but these native shrublands are becoming more and more invaded by non-native grasses. And in analyzing what is driving those changes, we do find that type conversion is largely driven by fire, and it's largely driven by short fire return intervals. But there's also an interplay of site aridity and potentially drought. And so the work that I did was focused in Ventura County And I found that short fire return intervals of 8 years or less led to type conversion. And so this required relatively frequent fires, fires to happen relatively quickly in time. However, other researchers, John Keeley and Alexandria Safard, doing similar research in the Santa Monica Mountains in Los Angeles, found that type conversion required a fire return interval of 10 years or less. And so this means that in a slightly more southern area, potentially slightly more arid and higher temperatures, actually requires more time to recover. It needs a larger fire-free interval in order for type conversion to not occur. And then those same researchers also did a similar study in San Diego County, and they found that even farther south, where we might expect even drier, hotter areas, needed even longer to recover. Short interval or fire return intervals of 15 years or less led to type conversion there. And so we can see this kind of north-south gradient of fire return intervals leading to conversion, which we can hypothesize, and in fact, preliminary data shows is largely due to site aridity and potentially drought effects. And then also could potentially be due to the ratio of cedars and resprouters in each of these study areas. Generally, farther south, you're going to have a higher abundance of cedar species, and farther north, you're going to have a higher abundance of resprouter species. And so this might also be a fact of in San Diego, we need more time for recovery in between fires because of that higher ratio of cedars. And so that is research I've done that shows how fire regimes are shaping vegetation communities, and going forward, how changing fire regimes might influence the vegetation we see in our backyard. And the other two questions I don't really have time to go into today, but I just want to mention that I think that though that's really where the nuanced approach that can really aid in some of the things that Ken mentioned comes into play. Because by better understanding the ecology of how fires affect plants, we can potentially start doing more prescribed burning and extend the burn windows, because we can imagine this conflict of prescribed burning can be a really effective fuel load reduction, but if you have certain vegetation species of interest, you want to be really careful in burning and potentially causing local extinction of them in your area. But if we better understand the ecology of how these plants are affected by fire, we can potentially have more prescribed burns that have ecological foundation, assuring us that we might actually be helping the plants, or at least not harming them to the point of losing them within the land that we're managing. And then also, just quickly, I'll add that as Matthew showed, wildfire is potentially going to become more frequent and more severe as climate change worsens, and drought, in fact, will also become more severe and potentially more frequent. We can also, answering these three questions, start to predict how fire and drought are going to interact in the future to affect the vegetation we see in our backyard, and in response, affect the wildland urban interface and where people are living and developed. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and just flash my email for you to feel free to reach out and ask any questions you might have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shane, for that. Really, really interesting. And thanks to all of our speakers tonight. Really appreciate it. At this point, we're kind of opening up. If anyone had any additional questions, comments, please feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. I'm happy to ask it for you. All right. Looks like our presenters did a killer job here. Oh, all right, we got one. What about the possibility of establishing local seed banks to be employed in times where there is not enough time to properly revegetate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so a lot of the restoration work that I do is in fact chaparral restoration, and it's a very challenging community to restore. The plants are hard to grow, they're hard to establish and get to survive. Establishing seed banks is something that we've thought about. The first step is kind of evaluating what seed banks still exist in these degraded areas. And that's hard because most of these species don't germinate readily. And so work that an undergraduate researcher who's working with me and I are actually just finishing up right now has been testing ways to stimulate chaparral seeds that are actively in soil. And some of the results we found are promising that you can actually stimulate seeds that are buried in soil cores you collect. And so that will hopefully allow us to determine more definitively if there is a native seed bank present or not in the area. And if we find the answer is no, reseeding just to kind of rebuild the seed bank for the next time a fire burns through could be a really promising approach. But two kind of nuances I'll add to that briefly, quickly, are that there's a big debate on the locality of your seeds and kind of where you collect and where you plant or where you introduce genes from. And so if you have large areas that have already degraded, there might be some ethical concerns of where you're getting your seeds to seed back in. And then also, as you saw on that brief picture of chaparral that I showed, they're extremely dense stands. And so the seed bank is incredibly built up in mature chaparral stands. And so generally you'll have thousands of seedlings regenerate post-fire and a survival rate of maybe only 1 or 2%. And so reseeding a seed bank dense enough to actually lead to effective regeneration post-fire might also be a challenge. But it is an idea that we want to look at in future research.
Great answer. Thank you, Shane. Appreciate that. Any other questions while we're here? All right. Well, we got one more coming in. So someone's wondering if we can address the interface of water supplies and fire. So you kind of talking about like the Thomas fire a few years back. Is that what you're kind of getting at? Feel free to unmute if you want. Are you talking about how we're having more fires and using more water in terms of drought? And fire, drought. I guess I'm not really understanding what you're trying to ask. So are you saying more fire, more water, and we don't have much water available? Is that what you're kind of getting at, Peggy? Well, I will assume that's what she's getting at. So I'm going to ping to Kenneth here real quick then. So what is there an issue, an underlining issue coming about that, you know, we're using more and more water to suppress these fires or treat them, but we're running out of that water supply at the same time? I think that's what she's getting at.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I know I can't say we use a great amount of water on wildland fires.
I guess that's kind of maybe a better answer is how, when you are using water, how are you using it on wildland fires?
Typically, you know, hose lines from fire engines to suppress fire, to protect structures, things like that. We'll also use water from our aerial resources, our helicopters, air tankers mostly drop retardant. Sometimes we have to drop water with them in sensitive areas, but typically they're used for fire retardant. But it really doesn't take a great deal of water to put out, you know, a wildfire that we can manage. Yeah. You know, we typically run a hose line that's about 30 gallons a minute. I mean, we can use larger lines on fires, but typically up in the hills, when we're dragging a hose line, we're not dragging a big 3-inch hose. We're dragging a small 1.5-inch hose with feeders off of that, or laterals that are 1 inch, you know.
More combination of different best management practices to accomplish fuel management, brakes, all that. That would make sense. Matthew, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Ken maybe a different kind of water related question, which is, I don't know, Ken, if you're responsible for doing the live fuel moisture monitoring throughout the county during the year, but I'm curious, are you guys picking up trends in the last couple of decades of drier and drier fuels into the season? And I imagine then that the answer might be yes, and presume that if it's so, that there's a connection there with sort of the prevalence or ability to burn. But do you track that, and does it factor in a meaningful way?
That is one of the jobs that I'm responsible for. We do, we try to gather our live fuel samples twice a month And then we weigh them and figure out what the moisture is. And they are trending down. They are lower than historical average right now, but that's because of our dry season we've had. We had limited rain this winter time, so they are drier going into this fire season than typical. Over the years, we've seen it trend up and down depending on the amount of moisture or precipitation that we get in the rainy season. Over the drought years that we had prior to a few years ago, we had like 6 or 7 years of heavy drought. The field moistures dropped continuously. They would come up a little bit in the winter time, but they never reached their typical high. So we came into a couple of those fire seasons very low. Like this season, we're coming in pretty low. Right now, our average field moistures in the county are between 70 and 100%. And when we talk about live fuel moistures, I spoke about old growth vegetation and new growth vegetation. We kind of have thresholds. Old growth vegetation, 15 to 20 years old or older, will carry fire because of that dead component. When the fuel moistures reach about 100%, we start seeing very active fire in that fuel bed. When the newer growth vegetation, anything that's burned within the last 15 years or so, and it's newer, because that the lack of the dead component and that understory, it takes the fuel moisture to get below about 80% for it to carry fire by itself. But then when you add wind or terrain slope to that, it helps move that fire by preheating ahead of itself. When we reach a 60%, that's our critical point. Once we hit 60%, fire will carry readily through that fuel bed. In 2000, I think it was 16, our driest year, we had live fuel moistures down into the 40s. And if it gets below that, they say below 30, it won't recover. So we were getting pretty low.
Interesting. So it seems like there's a trend forming slowly. Interesting. Thank you. Great question, Peggy. All right, everyone. Well, with that, I will, oh, no, we got one more coming in. We're going to address it here. What is fire retardant exactly? That is a good question. What's the makeup of it? Anyone?
I don't know exactly the chemical compounds, but I would say that it's a blend of Phos-Chek is what it's called that we use. It's a blend of water, mostly water. It has a dye in it, so we can see it on the ground after the aircraft drops it. It has some fertilizer mixed in to help regenerate in the future after the fire. So those are the basics. I don't know all the chemical compounds of them, but
oh, interesting. I never would have thought about the fertilizer aspect of it.
Add a little bit of fertilizer to the retardant.
That's very cool. That's very cool to know. Great question. Any other questions here? We'll give another second here before we announce the next meeting and close out. You can always feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to ping it to our speakers tonight too, and we can always follow up that way. Like I said, we're hosting this in collaboration with the Ventura Regional Fire Safe Council as a service to our community. So whenever you have any questions, please reach out and let us know. That's what we're all here for. We're here to interface and help you better understand. So our next meeting is going to be Tuesday, July 6th at 6 p.m. It's going to discuss the Ready, Set, Go program that was, and correct me, Kenneth, if I'm wrong, but that was created by Ventura County Fire, I believe. So they're talking about the Ready, Set, Go program and what that entails. And then after that, again, our meeting will be in September, every other month. So thanks again to everyone for attending tonight. This is going to be posted. A recording is going to be posted on the vcrcd.org website by next week. So feel free to either ping me or go check our website for an update, and you can share that link. If you know anyone else who lives in the wildland urban interface or just interested in fire, please feel free to outreach. These are open to everyone in the community. We really appreciate the time, and thank you to all the speakers tonight for taking the time out of your evening to speak with us. Really cool information, very, very good information. And we look forward to talking to everyone soon. Everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.